All right, everybody. Final stretch. Well done. Thank you for getting this far with me, sticking it out. Next poems that we're going to cover, next and last, promise, poems that we're going to cover are Randall Jarrell's The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, Philip Larkin's High Windows. I can't remember which of the two poems I said at the beginning of this video that we were going to cover, but we're going to work on High Windows, mostly because it's the shorter one, and it sort of speaks to church-going as well, depending on which poem you fancy more. We're also going to talk about Margaret Atwood's You Fit Into Me and Seamus Heaney's Digging. We're skipping PK Page because of reasons, which will be announced. Those are the poems we're going to work on in this video. So, The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, very short, but accomplishes more impact in its, 5 short lines than many much longer poems I have known. One of the really key things you have to know about this poem is what a ball turret is. In some World War II fighter jets, there was this thing called a ball turret, and if you just Google it, do an image search, you'll find lots of very clear pictures, but it's like this ball, this like sphere it's partly armored, but it's like basically glass, and it can kind of roll around in its casing wedged into the bottom of the plane. And so the person in it, the person who just curls up in this little ball with this big, like anti-aircraft artillery gun, can roll around in the ball turret as the plane is flying to aim with greater agility at other planes than the mounted guns on, say, the wings of the plane. And it was an extremely dangerous position to have, obviously. Just by its very description, it was a notoriously dangerous position. If you're the ball turret gunner, you don't come back. 9 times out of 10, at least 9 times out of 10, you don't come back. And this poem is... it's still, to this day, I've read this poem so many times and it still just makes my skin crawl because it uses a thing that we have talked about in our lessons, juxtaposition, so strongly in its metaphors. This is a poem about a grown man, a soldier who's fighting in a war, arguably the most adult and, according to typical portrayals, the most masculine, the most sort of aggressive, situation possible. It's the absolute opposite, the antithesis of all things nurturing, feminine, tender, familial, belonging to childhood, any of that. And yet, these are the two sorts of realms that Randall Jarrell crashes together in this poem. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, capital S. That line all by itself could be a poem. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state. Well, what exactly is my mother's sleep? Is this something to do with, like a lack of awareness, a lack of sort of vigilance or worldliness among mothers, that they were caught sleeping in a way when the time came and their boys, their sons were, like in Dulcet et Decorum Est, pumped full of, the glory of war and swept off by this capital S seducing, serpentine, traitorous state. The government say, hey, come fight for us. We, again, in Wilfred Owen's Dulcet et Decorum Est, we talked about how the Latin root of country, from which we now get patriotic, is patria. There's a link between the way we refer to nation and the name for father, or pater, in Latin. So there's this almost like malevolent male counterpart emblematized in the state that's pulling these boys away from their mothers to soldiering. There's so much just in that one line. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state. But, then I ask myself, okay, is it that the mother is asleep? Or is it that the child was asleep inside its mother And so calling it my mother's sleep is a way of joining the two in this sort of fundamental union, like when he was being carried in his mother's body. It was from my mother's sleep, almost capital M, capital S, from my mother's sleep, my infancy. I fell, dropped, was born, but in a slipping, uncontrolled kind of way. I fell into the state that is life, the state that is danger, alienation, or the country. Like, you can parse this first line like basically forever, but let's read the whole poem. From my mother's sleep I fell into the state, and hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. I hunched in its belly. So now the ball turret, which is on the bottom of the plane, is being compared to the mother's pregnant belly, but also sort of the belly of the beast, the belly of the state. It's emblematic for these two juxtaposed parental figures that oversee the child's destiny. Till my wet fur froze. That almost, like, you get the image of like some kind of baby animal that's been born and is still kind of slick and its fur is wet. But of course we know that World War II fighter jets often had fur collars. And when you're flying at great heights, especially I think in the ball turret, there can be issues with like condensation and stuff like that. So partly that fragment of image is drawn from the realities of being a ball turret gunner, and partly it's part of that metaphor of innocence and infancy and dependency and helplessness. I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, straight up. And again, think Mother Earth. There's this new emphasis of the alienation from the mother, right? I'm 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life. Think of the baby in the womb dreaming its not quite realized life, you know? It's like the mental life of the unborn infant is perpetual dream. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, something that's now almost unreal. Life on Earth is so far away, so unthinkable when you're in the ball turret. I woke to black flak, that's gunfire from fighter jets. I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. That's pretty much what it sounds like. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. They absolutely did. That's literal. And I hate that I don't have to impress upon you that is true and possible and a realistic depiction, because many of you will have read the coverage of what happened when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, and some of what happened to the people who tried to cling on to the undercarriage of the departing flights. This is the real punch of the poem. We begin with this intricate, densely woven, hugely implicating series of juxtaposed metaphors and suggestive images and this dreamy quality, and then we wake with the fourth line, I woke. And now it becomes, aside from sort of the figurative language of nightmare fighters, it becomes almost imagist, incredibly crisp, absolutely unflinching, literal. I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. It's literal. The other thing that could be observed about that final line in terms of its associative images or metaphors is that the sense of washing the debris of this figure that's previously been depicted as a baby out from the ball turret that's been depicted as a womb or a pregnant belly, washing it out with a hose, it carries a really angry and really negative connotation of the technologies of abortion, especially the technologies of abortion in 20th century. And that reflects very much on the co-opting parent, the state. From my mother's sleep I fell into the state and hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. But when I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Dark, dark, dark stuff. But gives you a sense of just the sheer economy of the lines, how densely packed with meaning a very short poem can be in this case. And this is the last of the World War, explicitly World War poems that we're going to be working on. But it makes a really good transition, I think, as a World War II poem into some of these more like mid-20th century or latter modernist period writers who are going to be emblematic of the irreverence and the iconoclasm and what I earlier referred to as the gleefully tipping all sacred cows. This generation that is just reckoning with like, nope, there is no God, nothing is sacred, there's no meaning, there's no nothing. We're here on our own. This is it. What we make of it, that's it. Some of the writers that we look at next, especially Philip Larkin, and to some degree, Margaret Atwood's poem will probably have a lot of kinship with this poem. Enough narrating. We'll just go straight into it. Yes, so as I said, Philip Larkin, High Windows. Philip Larkin is an Irish poet, but I believe he's sometimes described as Anglo-Irish. I'm going to double check that and make sure that I put a confirmation in the notes. This is High Windows. I do not apologize for the profanity. When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, I know this is paradise. Everyone old has dreamed of all their lives. Bonds and gestures pushed to one side like an outdated combine harvester, and everyone going down the long slide to happiness endlessly. I wonder if anyone looked at me 40 years back and thought, that'll be the life. No God anymore, no sweating in the dark about hell and that, or having to hide what you think of the priest. He and his lot will all go down the long slide like free bloody birds. And immediately, rather than words, comes the thought of high windows, the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing, and is nowhere, and is endless. Tremendous irreverence, deliberate, gleeful, grateful irreverence in this poem. There's a sense of gratitude that the oppressiveness of the church and of its dogmatism and its fear-mongering, some people find, has been finally and completely, like forever, don't know why I can't think of the word, it's just been done away with. It's been completely undermined by this sort of wake-up call of the first half of the 20th century. And with the progression of the 20th century, there are coming to be advances in medical technologies for family planning and things like that. And so many people, I mean, Philip Larkin comes from a Catholic background, I believe, where there were like very specific sort of church-forwarded rules against contraception, and that's in some Catholic communities still the case. It's obvious that this poet had a really bleak experience of what religion was supposed to be about. It revolved so much around what you can't do, what you can't be or think or feel. A lot of guilt, a lot of the fear of hell. And yet what's interesting to me is that as he's talking about, you know, the long slide of sex, going down the long slide, you know, forever and ever, or all the priests going down the long slide of, you're out of here. In all that he's talking about this, the image that he comes to at the very end, high windows, is a church image. It's those upper level, pointed or domed, often stained glass windows. And yet, instead of stained glass, it's no longer the typical windows of the church. It's now just the shape of that window that opens on deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. There is this rejoicing in the transformation of belief from something that has to shape itself to the prescriptions of another to something that simply looks on the world with openness and dwells without expectations or the need to define things. It strikes me as really, really interesting that in this poem you can feel so strongly Larkin trying to shake off the church and to kind of like contradict and contravene it. And yet, if you have a look over in the other poem, Church Going, that's going to make kind of an extended commentary on some of the tensions or juxtapositions of imagery in this poem. Particularly, you know, when you get to the line, a serious house on serious ground. There's this lingering sense for Larkin, but churches are something, and they do something that no other institution or building or ceremony has yet figured out how to do. And will we ever quite rid ourselves or naturally stop needing that thing, that something that churches do? There's an open question there, and it's beautifully worked out, and I really hope you enjoy it and would love to hear any of your reflections on it. I want to go from there straight into Margaret Atwood, You Fit Into Me. Again, another extremely short poem and one of my all-time favorite poems. If somebody asked me, what is your favorite poem ever, I would say, that's not fair. Are you a psychopath? What a cruel question. But then, in terms of like a top 5, Margaret Atwood's You Fit Into Me would definitely be among the candidates. Margaret Atwood is definitely a transitional figure from modernism to what's called postmodernism, which I'll talk about a little bit towards the end of this video if I can, and if not, in our intro to the Drama Week video. This is You Fit In... Oh, no, I was going to say one more thing about Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood did something for feminism in writing, in poetry and in fiction, that I think was really pivotal and has been lapped up and gathered up and built on by many significant female authors since Atwood. But I think sometimes she's not given due credit for being like, she kind of started this. One of the ways that Margaret Atwood demonstrates her feminism is by writing really, really excellent female villains. She writes women who are just as capable of malevolence, of criminal masterminding, of deception, of violence as men. In scenarios where somebody's trying to parse through what has gone wrong in a community or in a situation or in a family, there's often in Margaret Atwood's stories this kind of like, but it like, the women aren't the likely suspects, and that's purely a matter of prejudice. Why not? Why couldn't it be a woman? Margaret Atwood really, one of the things she does so well is she brings an ominousness and a crunch of doom impending to her work, and specifically where female figures are involved. And this poem is a beautiful example of how she takes a fundamentally feminine bit of imagery and a typical sort of romantic idea and just breaks its neck like a baby bird. what some of you may not know is what a hook and eye closure is, because they're not used very much anymore. Today they're often on like formal wear more than just everyday dresses, but it's a fixture usually of women's clothes, dresses and skirts. At the top of the zipper, to make sure the zipper stays closed, instead of, say, a button or something like that, there would be a hook and eye. And I found a dress in our house that has one, so I'll show it to you there. There's the hook, and there, if I can move the fabric away from it, there is the eye. You can just see through it. So the hook goes into the metal eye to create a closure to keep the zipper shut, so that there are no untoward circumstances. This will clarify your understanding of the poem. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. Hot damn. It's this beautiful silken, bedroomy, oh, you're my soulmate, you fit into me perfectly, we're made for each other, like a hook and eye clasp, like, darling, would you do me up, please, I can't reach. Like, it's just, too much. It's so perfumey and lovely. And then she twists it. Not a hook as in a hook and eye closure, a fish hook, a barbed, metal, violent, cold fish hook. And not the eye of a hook and eye closure, but the tender, vulnerable, essential eye of a person, a human eye, open. You fit into me like a hook in an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. This is not a good relationship. No ma'am, no sir. No gender non-binary individual who's asking me. 4 lines, I'm going to count them. 4 is 8, 10, 13, 16 words. 16 words this poem is. Wham bam. It's a bit imagist. It's definitely calling on the heritage of imagist poetry. It's also an example of a postmodern dynamic, a dynamic of this movement of literature that came after modernism and which has only ever been successfully described as postmodernism, which is revisionism. That's a characteristic of postmodernism. Taking old narratives and breaking them down and questioning them and interrogating them and sort of rewriting them with a new consciousness. The Wide Sargasso Sea is a text that I mentioned in connection with Jane Eyre. It is a revisionist novel that comments back on Jane Eyre. That's a classic postmodern move. Also self-consciousness. The text that knows it is a text, that knows it's a project, that it has an agenda. You'll see that very clearly in Margaret Edson's Wit coming up next week. Wit knows that it's a play. It doesn't stop being a play just because it knows, but it breaks the fourth wall, like the imaginary wall between players and audience, all the time. She talks directly to you. Self-conscious, postmodern. Susan Glaspell's Trifles is squarely modern, even a bit early modern. Wit is our example of kind of drama that has made that leap into the postmodern self-consciousness. Seamus Heaney's Digging is another poem that is a bit self-aware, a bit conscious of the need for revision or for a second layer of commentary on the old contemplations. Seamus Heaney's poem, it's this extended meditation on his father's aptitude with the tools of his time and his trade, the shovel, the spade. And at the same time, the poet is meditating on the tools of his time and his trade, the pen. And it's like a fountain pen, you know, the broad-nibbed pen, I think he calls it, or the wide-nibbed pen. It has a passing resemblance to a spade, but in miniature. And the final line of the poem, he says, I'll dig with it. I'm going to dig into the earth of my home, to the meat of my stories, to the depths of language and poetry. I'm going to dig with it. And, you know, when he says about his father, by God, the man could handle a spade, Heaney is trying to get to be the person about whom it will be said, by God, he could handle a pen. He could dig with it. And you can hear my accent coming out because I have kindred with this person. Kindredness, kinship. But it's that idea of you can almost, there's the poet at his desk watching the person who's in the world, you know, doing the typical sort of daily work, and he's writing about it. And there's this sense of overlay, right? Of he's writing about things. That kind of layering effect is a classically sort of postmodern theme or trope or effect. And it's, Seamus Heaney is just a really obvious scholar and writer who kind of straddles the modern and postmodern periods and has work that emblematizes both of those periods so well. And I felt that digging really kind of like brought those two branches of things together really well. That's been a pretty short gloss of digging. I didn't feel that it needed any kind of serious close reading, but as I said at the beginning of this series, if there's anything I didn't cover that you were just really, really hoping that I would, please do reach out or comment in the videos, like let me know somehow, and we'll do some more unpacking of things. In the meantime, God love you all for sticking with me, and we will see at least a few of you on Monday.